For anybody who doesn't know John Curtice, I'll do a quick intro and then John's going to take us through a bit of his election review as he saw it. So John obviously is a well-renowned British political scientist, is probably known by a lot of you from his interactions on places like the BBC and other broadcasting organisations, giving polls and giving predictions as to how elections might pan out. He's also the Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, which, as he mentioned, is obviously one of the universities which was in Glasgow Kelvin, where I ran in the Scottish Parliament elections. And John was quite involved as well in grilling some of the candidates there, as well as a Senior Research Fellow at the National Centre for Social Research and President of the British Polling Council. And John, I'm led to believe now, forgive me if I'm wrong here, because Wikipedia is not always 100% right, but it says from 2005 to 2017, you gave absolutely accurate predictions on the outcome of the general election. Now, does that suggest that your prediction for 2019 wasn't accurate? Because I didn't think it wasn't accurate, but for some reason, Wikipedia omits 2019.
I think somebody needs to update the Wikipedia, actually, I think is my answer to that question. Certainly 2019 was better than 2015, but anyway, we got away with it in 2015 because although we didn't say the Tories were going to get a majority, we didn't say the Tories wouldn't get a majority, and we were so much closer than everybody else that everybody thought it was brilliant. But anyway, yeah, okay. Indeed, I also managed, David, to post something on my What Scotland Thinks website on May the 6th saying that the central best for the estimate for the SNP was 64 seats. So I might claim 2021 as well now. Anyway.
I don't blame you. So John, I've obviously primed everyone up that recently John Potter, who's one of my co-hosts on the Lib Dem Pod, and I and other people like Laura did our election review internally, and actually we ended up Ian Dale commented apparently he'd listened to that podcast review and felt that we'd been too happy clappy about the results that we'd managed to get in May. So if I leave it to you to give us a bit of your thoughts in terms of how you felt those elections went.
Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Praetor Rains. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Praetor Rains have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their LibDem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help LibDems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Praetor Rains are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, LibDem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Praetor Rains website at praetorrains.co.uk/liberal-democrats. This podcast has been sponsored by the Katora Coffee Club, the UK's most environmentally friendly coffee club. There are over 400 independent roasters in the UK, each one crafting coffee in their own unique style. Katora Coffee Club works with some of the best to take you on a voyage of coffee discovery. The Katora Coffee Club delivers ethically sourced and independently roast coffee directly to your door. Each month you'll receive between 2 and 4 bags of coffee and their monthly extract magazine. Even better for LibDem podcast listeners, use the code BETTERCOFFEE to save 5% on subscriptions and gift boxes for a limited time only. All Katora Coffee Club boxes are carbon negative and offset the CO2. So why not do some good, enjoy some great coffee and check out the website www.katoracoffeeclub.com. Now, back to the podcast.
I was interested in what you had to say about Chesham and Amersham anyway. Some of us think that it might be slightly more interesting than Batley and Spen. But anyway, we'll see. Well, if you were all happy clappy about the May 6 elections, I'm going to give you the opposite end of the spectrum. This is not going to be happy clappy. I'm going to suggest that the elections basically raise a couple of really important questions about where the party is currently at. Questions that certainly might well be alleviated if you manage to do well in Chesham and Amersham, as I think you certainly very badly need to do. But let me walk you through this. I'll go through this quite quickly because not all of it is immediately relevant to the Democrats, but quite a lot of it is. So before you discuss anything about the elections on the May the 6th, the first thing that was absolutely crucial, of course, was to understand the way in which Brexit changed the character of party support between 2015 and 2019, and the extent to which that did, and in one instance no longer does, carry through still into the character support for political parties. So basically, to cut a long story short, support for the Conservatives became very heavily concentrated amongst Leave voters between 2015 and 2019. Labour's vote became somewhat more concentrated amongst Remain voters than Leave voters over this period. And meanwhile, support for Liberal Democrats, basically all of the rise in Liberal Democrat support in 2019 occurred amongst Remain voters, and the party was virtually wholly a party characterised by the support of those who had voted Remain. So these resulted in quite marked changes in the character of support for all of Britain's parties. It is, for example, exemplified in the class character of their support. Support for the Conservatives is now higher, was higher in 2019 amongst working class voters than Labour's was. And equally, the party whose vote is now most concentrated in a particular social class is Liberal Democrats, which is very heavily focused on middle class voters, which of course is very, very different from the traditional picture of Liberal Democrat support. All of this has also had obvious impacts on the geography of party support, including, as you can see, Liberal Democrats, by the way, they're grey in most of these graphs. That's just how Bill Gates sets things up, and I can't get around to changing it. But the Conservative support rose dramatically in Leave constituencies, fell in Remain constituencies of the kind like Cheshire and Amersham. The Liberal Democrats, meanwhile, insofar as they made progress in 2019 over 2015, were doing so more heavily in Remain areas. In fact, it's particularly more heavily in Conservative Remain areas. So that's a crucial change. And unless this has unraveled since 2019, it was going to work through these local elections, because these local elections were, of course, for the most part, taking place in contests that were previously held in 2016 and 2017. Now, for the most part, I'm going to focus on the local elections in England outside of London, and then I'm going to kind of use that then to illustrate, then to point to how this fits in with the picture elsewhere. But of course, across the elections of a piece, including in the local elections, we were, because of the postponement of last year, looking at elections that in part were seats that were last defended in 2016 and in part last defended in 2017. And these were two very different baselines. There are also two different sets of elections, by the way. The 2017 elections were much more in Conservative area, much more in areas where the Democrats tend to be stronger. The 2016 seats were much more in Labour areas. That affects the Liberal Democrats' prospects. But what also made a difference to these elections was the fact that in 2016, Conservative and Labour were relatively neck and neck, whereas in 2017, actually the local elections took place after Theresa May had called the general election, the Conservatives were well ahead. And they didn't do that so well in the local elections, but even so far as the two largest parties were concerned, unless Brexit had given that where the parties were at in the polls compared to where they were before May 21, then basically Labour were heading for losing ground in the 2016 seats, but that there could still be a swing to Labour in the 2017 seats. But that so far as Liberal Democrats were concerned, well, they always do better in local elections than they do in current opinion polls. No reason, therefore, for that to change. But at 7% in the polls leading into the May 21 elections, they're basically in the same position, slightly better than in 2016, and actually in a slightly worse position than the polls before 2017. So the party might make a bit of ground in 2016 seats, but lose a bit of ground in 2017 seats on average. What about the Remain-Leave divide? What's happened to this since 2019? Well, the Labour Party may have decided it doesn't want to talk about Brexit. The Democrats seem to have been deeply reluctant to talk about Brexit. Conservatives, of course, are still happy to talk about Brexit. And the truth is that the electorate are also, when it comes to their electoral choice, still talking about Brexit and have been throughout the period since 2019. This is showing you the level of support for the parties now separately back in the general election amongst Remain and Leave voters, in October of last year when Labour were at their strongest, and in April just before the local elections. Let's just first of all look at Conservative and Labour. Basically, the Conservatives have been hanging on to 20% support or so amongst Remain voters. They've been a bit weaker amongst Leave voters, but that in part is because perceptions of the government's handling the pandemic have always been weaker amongst Leave voters. But the Conservatives are still very, very heavily dependent on Leave voters, far more dependent on Leave voters than they were in 2016 or in 2017. Labour, meanwhile, despite staying knout about Brexit for 12 months, their support amongst Leave voters is still basically running at little more than it was back in 2019. Their support amongst Remain voters is just as it was in 2019. And indeed, even in October, when they were at their highest, yes, they gained a bit of ground amongst Leave voters, but they'd also gained just as much ground amongst Leave voters. There was every reason to believe that Labour was going to lose ground more heavily in Leave voting areas, and the Conservatives were going to gain ground more in such areas. But what about Liberal Democrats? Well, support for Liberal Democrats is still higher in Remain areas than it is in Leave areas. But you will see how the support for the party has fallen amongst Remain voters since 2019. And that indeed, that's basically where the decline in party support has happened. And actually, therefore, if you look at the character of the party support in the polls leading into the local elections, what you can see here is that basically the party was back to where it was in 2015. It's, yes, more popular amongst Remain voters, but the balance of its support is now pretty much back to where it was. Because actually, even as compared with the 2019 local elections, even the 2019 local elections, at that stage, this was before the Liberal Democrat vote took off in 2019, and the party support was still roughly of the kind that it was in 4 weeks ago, indeed it still is now. The support for the party rose very much after those local elections, some of which was then retained in the general election. But actually, therefore, in these local elections, there wasn't any reason to expect the Liberal Democrat performance in terms of change in share of the vote to be any different in Remain seats as compared with Leave seats, right? And that, therefore, what you would expect, doing a bit better in 2016 seats, losing ground a little bit in 2017 seats, but then, of course, all of this in terms of seat gains and losses then being contingent on the support and the change in support for Conservative and Labour. Well, this is basically all that played out. Just finally, before we get into that, you can then see how the projected national share for the party, this is our estimate of how well all the parties were doing. And basically, fairly standard performance for the Liberal Democrats throughout the post-coalition period. At times when in the polls, they've been typically at around 7-8%, has been around 16% or so of the vote, a little bit better in 2017, a little bit better in 2019. But in 2021, the overall performance, very, very much in line with what has been the position for a long time. So all of the post-European elections rise, all the rise in support in the general election has all disappeared. So, how do the local elections play out? Do they match expectations? Well, basically they do. You can see Conservatives up in 2016 wards, Labour down, Liberal Democrats up a little bit. In 2017 wards, not much movement, but Labour is a small net swing to Labour, and the Liberal Democrats are down a bit, just as we would expect given the position in the polls. This therefore means that in terms of seats won, virtually all the Conservative gains are in 2016 wards. Liberal Democrats, basically 3 net losses in the 2016 wards, 11 net gains in the 2017 ones. Again, the party is treading water. And again then, if we look at the impact of the change according to Brexit, well, as we would expect, the Conservatives gaining ground very strongly. In 2016, Leave wards, losing ground in the Remain ones, opposite pattern for Labour and Liberal Democrats, yes, as we would anticipate, given that the Remain Leave division in party support is now pretty much back to what it was before 2019 European elections. Slight increase, but a slight increase everywhere, irrespective of the Remain Leave character of the ward. In 2017, the same pattern for Conservative and Labour, but the Liberal Democrats just losing ground a little bit everywhere. Indeed, even comparing it with the 2019 elections, which you can do for the 2016 ward, the decline in the Liberal Democrat vote is pretty much even across the Remain Leave divide. So the crucial clear message here is that these local election results confirm the message of the opinion polls that A, the party is in the doldrums, that basically it's just recording the kind of overall level of support in these local elections that you would expect given its national poll position and given that it always does better in local elections than its current national poll position. And that therefore this is confirmed that basically the Liberal Democrats have lost all of those gains amongst Remain voters, some of which they still had in the 2019 local election. And basically then when you look at the results elsewhere, they're pretty much all of a piece of this. So we look at London, where of course the most Remain part of the country. Well, there's some a London Assembly list and in the London Mayor, despite the fact that this is Remain voting parts of the country. It's very similar to the 1% increase in the local elections. There's no particularly remarkably good performance. In Scotland, very much a pro-Remain part of the country, no particular evidence of a particularly good performance. Wales, of course, is a Remain Leave voting area, but the party just does relatively badly in Wales, just part of a continuing long-term pattern. So all of this, of course, raises the question, well, what's happened to the 2019 Liberal Democrat vote? Where is it? Where has it gone? And the answer is it's gone predominantly to the Labour Party. It's this that's helped to shore up Labour support amongst Remain voters. Some of it, although, has also gone to the Conservatives, I think almost undoubtedly, this is those Conservative Remain voters, some of them going back to the Conservatives now the general election is over, and some of whom doubtless you might be hoping to win back in the context of a by-election in Chesham and Amersham. And it'll be interesting to see whether you do so. But you can just basically see that the party's only hanging on to about 3/5 of its 2019 vote. So that's message number one. Message number two, of course, is that one of the crucial features of Liberal Democrat performance really since 1997 onwards has been an ability to concentrate its support in geographical strongholds. And I think a second message that come out of these local elections, that it really does underline the message that it's not entirely clear that the party's strategy in this respect is now working to the extent that it needs to do so. So this is back to local elections, and this is just looking at the change in party support broken down by separately for 2016 and 2017, according to how well the party did in a ward back in 2016/2017 as appropriate. And the bit to note is the far right-hand side. These are the wards where the Liberal Democrats were strongest in 2016/2017, and it is in these wards where the party support was going down most strongly. The second thing to note, of course, is that insofar as the Liberal Democrats' parliamentary prospects are now concentrated in seats where they share first and second place with the Conservatives, you might be looking to see whether or not there is any evidence of the party's performance being particularly strong in Conservative Liberal Democrat wards as opposed to Conservative Labour wards where the party's in third place. Well, the truth is of that, there isn't any sign either. The party's vote is down a bit more in these wards than it is in Conservative Labour wards. And then you can look at some of the outcomes in Scotland and in Wales. And it is a litany of constituencies that the party once held at Westminster and or devolved level, in all of which there were marked declines in party support. And pretty much now, any constituency that was once held in Scotland or in Wales and is no longer held has now pretty much bitten the dust as being a place that has very much in the way of Liberal Democrat strength. Now, of course, it's not all bad news, and I thought I would leave you with at least one or two bright spots. Clearly, the party in the Southwest London Assembly constituency did begin to capitalise on the fact that this is an Assembly constituency and where the party holds 3 of the 5 parliamentary seats. And that began to show itself rather more this time around than it did back in 2016. Though that said, frankly, if the party was polling as well in this Assembly constituency as they are in the constituencies at Westminster, they'd be winning this constituency. Edinburgh Western and Fife North East, yes, the 2 mainland Scottish constituencies. The party consolidated very heavily. But that, frankly, is very much to do with tactical voting by unionist voters, which was going on a lot in Conservative and Labour-held constituencies as well. Some good signs in Hazel Grove and in Cheadle that the party's vote was building up a bit from what it was. Some progress in Caithness, which of course is held at Westminster, but not Scottish Parliament level, though we were still a long way off winning the seat. And some good signs in Surrey, strong performances in Tandridge, Guildford, etc. And Surrey, of course, has got a disproportionate number of Conservative Liberal Democrat seats. But that, I think, is pretty much it. So, 3 key messages. Basically, the party's back where it was in the immediate post-coalition era. So far as overall levels of support is concerned, these elections confirm that that is the case. These are, of course, the first elections since 2019. All of the gains that the party made amongst Remain voters in 2019, it's all gone, all lost, which to my mind does raise a question as to whether the fact that the party seems to have been reluctant to pick up the cudgels of being the one party that was still willing to challenge Brexit has indeed been the right decision. And finally, whatever you think about that, of course, the party does need to build some strong local strongholds. And at the moment, there are frankly more signs of former strongholds withering away than there is of new ones taking their place. And that obviously must be a concern for the party. Okay, I said I'd cheer you up, so there you go.
Well, thank you, John.
Just in case Ian Dale thinks you get a biased diet of cephalological information.
Well, my whole thing was Ian said, "Oh, we were too cheery," whereas I think when I spoke about Scotland's results, I was not very cheery at all. So I'm not too sure where he's getting that from. But thank you, John. That was a comprehensive dive into where the parties come for a number of years in both local and elsewhere. Just the note you kind of ended on there, just to add some follow-up questions, is obviously you said that raises a question about should the party perhaps have leaned more towards a commitment to a Remain and challenging Brexit. The one question I wanted to ask is obviously we saw in Scotland there was a huge amount of tactical voting that went on. And obviously I experienced that in the seat that I stood in, and that people told me, well, the only way I'm going to beat the SNP or the Greens is to vote for Labour. So as much as I might like you, I can't vote for you. How do you think that then plays into the national picture in Scotland? Because obviously there's a second question there that gets played on of, you have to vote Conservative, or you have to vote Labour, or you have to vote Lib Dem in any particular seat if you want to challenge the SNP. Do you think if we were to be more heavily Remain, it would give us difficulty in that area?
Well, it's certainly true that the position in Scotland is more complicated in that you would then be, well, the position at the moment in Scotland is that the SNP are gobbling up the Remain vote. And they're gobbling up the Remain vote, not least because, of course, what is now true in a way that was not true back in 2014 is that Europhiles are now much more likely to be in favour of independence. And that basically, the problem that you and all unionist parties face is that Brexit has frankly cleared your pitch. Right? It's become much more difficult to promote the union in post-Brexit. But what is also true is that although the SNP are still able to pick up a fair chunk of the Leave vote, the most popular party amongst Leave voters is the Conservatives. So the Conservatives are very much fishing in a niche market, which is of voters who are not only No, but Leave. Labour are just not picking up, they're just caught across the piece. They're not doing particularly well amongst Remain voters than they are amongst Leave voters. And that extent, at least, Labour's much weaker amongst Remain voters in Scotland than they are in either Wales or in England. But at least, I mean, so sure, you're going to find it difficult to pick up pro-independence Remain voters because pro-independence voters are just all of a piece voting for the SNP. That's just now a fundamental divide in Scotland, right? And if you're going to get them back, you've got to persuade them that independence is not a good idea, right? Otherwise, you're going to go nowhere. But that otherwise, at least you would at least be potentially be able to eat into the Labour vote because Labour's problem in Scotland is it doesn't want to talk about either of the two most important issues in voters' minds north of the border. This is not going to be an effective strategy. You at least are willing to talk about the constitutional issue all a bit. You're still wanting to promote a middle ground that I think, frankly, has had its legs cut from underneath it by Brexit because more devolution doesn't meet the fundamental objection that Brexit has stopped Scotland making its own choice in foreign affairs. But at least you're willing to talk about the subject. And at least if you're willing to talk about Brexit, at least you would have a message to convey on the two crucial issues, whereas Labour doesn't have a message on either. So I would still make that defence, but I mean I would say it more broadly, undoubtedly this is an English and Welsh, well it's not even Wales because frankly the party in Wales is it is predominantly an English argument, and I think I think the party vastly overreacted to the experience of 2019 and said, there's no evidence, by the way, that Joe Swinson's argument that we should just cancel Brexit, put Remain voters off. The problem you faced in 2019 was that you couldn't hang on to your Labour voters, because ex-Labour voters, because Labour moved its position on Brexit to be more accommodating to Leave voters. They finally accepted the idea of having a second referendum, albeit they wouldn't quite tell you what they'd say about it. And it's that. So, and the party needed something to keep those voters on board. And beyond Brexit, the party had nothing to say. So you couldn't keep these voters. But the fact that now Labour hasn't got anything to say about Brexit means that its Remain voters are potentially vulnerable, right? Because because Labour is no longer trying to hang on to them. You can already see the Greens scrabbling in this territory. If you had time to look at some of my graphs, you can see how the Green vote is rising while the more Remain areas. And I would just simply say, well, hey, look, you've got nothing to lose, because Leave voters ain't going to, in Labour's case, I can see the dilemma, all right? I can see the dilemma. But in your case, there is no dilemma. There are no Leave voters that you are going to pick up, right? That's just not going to happen. And it's not going to happen in the southwest of England, right? Your constituency is Remain voters. Your core constituency, the party's core constituency, has always been social liberals, university graduates. This is what the party has always been, its core constituency. It's why bloody tuition fees was a damn stupid idea. You need badly to reconnect with that constituency. You did that for a while in 2019 over Brexit, and it is the obvious issue with which you can still connect with that constituency, because, by the way, most Remain voters still don't believe in Brexit. They still think it's going to be an economic disaster. It is not true that Remain voters are, for the most part, accommodating themselves to the idea. And you can see above all the way in which they vote that is indeed, that's the case. So in the case of the Liberal Democrats, I see no downside at all, right? Look at the character of the bloody constituencies. It's London, right? It's Romania. It's middle-class social liberal graduate. And Surrey now is, part of exactly the same territory. What is there to lose? Frankly, and North East 5, it's the bloody University of St Andrews, right? Edinburgh Western is Edinburgh University, right? So just look at where you're at. Look at the character of the existing constituencies, because, the Leave ones you lost, right? So given where you're at, given that your best prospects are in conservative held constituencies, most of which are Remain voting constituencies, and given that to win those constituencies, yes, you've got to try to get Remain voters off the Tories, yeah, but you've also got to squeeze the Labour vote. What is there to lose, I ask myself? Well, and given also, above all, a party that is currently asphyxiated in the publicity stakes and in the oxygen of publicity. Now, and of course, the pandemic hasn't helped any opposition parties. But when we come out of the pandemic, you will desperately need some USP. And it's an obvious USP to go for. It shouldn't be your only USP, but it is an obvious USP to go for.
Well, it's interesting, John, because there's a couple of questions that I've sort of collated from people before we had this conversation, and you've touched on quite a few of them there. So I want to just dig into them a little bit. And then what I'm going to do, John, is Alistair Carmichael's joined us. So I know Alistair's never shy to give his opinion. So I'll bring him in shortly, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience to maybe offer some questions. But just first of all, the first piece where you talked there about, what is there to lose in talking about Remain. So Laura Gordon, who's one of our co-hosts, asked, just a slight follow-up to that question, do you then feel that our position on where we stand on the European Union, as in not now but later on, Do you feel that's correct? And if you do feel it's correct, is it just that we need to talk about it more? Or do you feel that we should actually explicitly say, no, we need to go back in as soon as possible?
I frankly think you should just simply say that Brexit's a damn stupid idea and that you would wish to do, and that, I mean, you might want to say that in the short run, it won't necessarily be practical to be trying to go back in, but you certainly be wanting to be completely renegotiating the free trade treaty, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the one difficult area still on Brexit, which a lot of Remain voters are still not very keen on, is freedom of movement. But I mean, that was the European Union's fault for not giving enough on freedom of movement back in 2016. You might not want to say we want to go back straight away, but I think you should certainly be saying it's a damn stupid idea. You want to renegotiate the free trade agreement. In so doing, you want to make it a hell of a lot easier to deal with the problems of the Northern Ireland Protocol, etc. And that you want to rejoin Erasmus, and you certainly want to be arguing for as close a relationship with the European Union as possible, with a view eventually to paving the pathway to putting back to the British public the question as to whether or not the UK should rejoin. So I think I would probably say, you would say you put it to a referendum rather than saying we just go back, but that you would put for a referendum in which you would be arguing that now we should be going back towards the European Union. I mean, you've got to come up with something that's pretty clear and pretty strong in order to be able to suggest to that constituency that you are serious about reversing a significant proportion of the Brexit deal. And I just don't see the downside. And it's very rare in politics that you can see that position in exactly the same way. This is where there is a crucial lesson to learn from Boris. All right, Boris, you have to admire him. Boris, there are some remarkable similarities between Johnson and Blair that probably neither of them would be willing to acknowledge. But one thing that both of them have in common is a willingness to reposition their parties in a way that cuts across the traditional grain of their parties and pitches their tent on the position of their opponents, right? That's what Johnson has done. It's what Blair has done. Now, Johnson, therefore, is not going to give up on leave. He managed to win that election 2019 by, supposedly renegotiating Northern Ireland Treaty, by then saying, this is it, this is Brexit, we're going to go for it, we're going to get it done, unites the leave vote, is willing to take the risk that he's going to lose some of his traditional centre-right Remain voters, which I've shown you he definitely did. But by uniting the leave vote, meanwhile, what's the story on the Remain side? Do we want Norway plus, Norway minus, Norway, Switzerland, something new, with or without a referendum? Who knows? Who cares? And the result is a completely divided Brexit vote. All right? This is an issue on which the crucial question at the end of the day is who is going to succeed in uniting the Remain vote. Labour is not positioned to do it at the moment. And given the character of your vote, given the character of your target constituencies, it's very rare in politics, it seems to be in politics, for to be so clear that a party might as well just stick to what it believes in.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, what I'm going to do at this point, John, is I think Alistair's messaged me and said he'd like to pick up on a couple of those points. So Alistair, are you with us?
I am indeed. And that noise you can hear is my mind boggling at the moment because there's so many different strands to pull together here. Let me I don't want to hog too much time because I know that other people are going to want to come in. 2019, I think you're right, John. I think that the Labour repositioning themselves was something which changed the environment for us. I think we were left a bit flat-footed, and at the end of the day, I think the reason that the Labour Party were able to do that was that, especially in the eyes of many of the people who had supported us traditionally, we were left looking unreasonable, and that was something that sat ill with them.
All I can say is I cannot find the survey evidence to support that proposition.
Well, it was what I got from people knocking doors. You know,
yeah, I know. I've heard that, but
you
people
get it a lot.
But you know what, Alistair, that what you get on the doors is a lot of people having decided not to vote for you will then bring to hand reasons as to why they won't do so, right?
Absolutely. And look, that's something, though, that we as a party are going to have to come to terms with, because I think one of the things that we've got wrong as a campaigning force in recent years is that we've been too ready to find reasons not to believe what we're hearing on the doorstep. And I think, you know, if we're going to sort of recover our position, especially sort of in key and target seats, then we're going to have to rebuild our operation in a way that gets past that. I'm picking my words with care here. What fascinates me, though, is essentially what lessons are there to be learned from the experience of Scottish independence and Brexit, because they are both exercises in identity politics. Now, this is the strategic question, I think, to the party in Scotland, was we got squeezed because the election became about the constitutional issue. Yep. And at one end of the spectrum, you had the SNP saying, yes, absolutely independence. At the other end of the spectrum, you had the Labour Party, you had the Conservatives saying, absolutely no. Now, we said no, but that's not what we want to talk about. We think that recovery is more important. Yeah. To the people on the yes side of the argument, they just hear the no. And to the people in the no end of the argument, they just hear the but, and they think that we are somehow less committed on that. Now, as a party, I still think it was important that people essentially had ideological option as opposed to an identity option. And that's why we took the stance that we did. My essay question is, will Brexit work the same way? Because they are both exercises in nationalism and identity politics. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, independence is one where the argument for change has not yet been won, and the Brexit, it looks as if it has been. So before I hitch my wagon to the Brexit or anti-Brexit, the pro-EU star, what is the polling evidence to say that that is going to be a determining factor in people voting in 2024? Or are we going to become like the Japanese prisoners of war?
Oh, okay. All right. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, so you're right. We do have to decide the extent to which this is still going to be an issue. Right. So I think let me make a few points. I mean, number one is that it has so far withstood 12 months of pandemic and has shown absolutely no sign of withering and dying. Okay? So that's one. Two, the Conservatives will definitely continue to want to try to politicize Brexit, and of course its associated issues. I mean, it's very interesting as to how Tory ministers are constantly taking up what you might call anti-woke positions, which again just feeds into that. So the social conservatism of Leave voters, right? I mean, even today, Oliver Dowden deciding to intervene into the case of the English fast bowler who said something apparently rather unpleasant many years ago when perhaps many teenagers stupidly said something rather unpleasant, But so, I know picking up the stuff about not getting rid of statues. This is, just as, you'll do with FMQs, Keir doesn't say anything about Brexit. And Boris says, but you're a Remoaner, really, right? So you can expect the Conservatives to continue to want to politicise the issue, all right? So they may well still try to go down that path. Now, of course, at this point, then much I think does undoubtedly depend on how successful, quote unquote, Brexit is. If, of course, Brexit is apparently a success in 2 or 3 years' time, by the time of the next election, although of course the next election may now be not much more than 2 years away, and that's a pretty short time frame, then sure, it may well be that people move on. Of course, it may well also be true that other issues will kick in. But certainly, it's perfectly clear that the Labour Party are hoping desperately that other issues will kick in. They want politics to go back to left versus right. That's where they are comfortable. Now, you at least are not uncomfortable talking about social liberalism, whereas they are, right? So that's one crucial difference. They want to go back to left, right, and they are wanting to be able to attack the government for not being left-wing enough, broadly speaking, not saying about inequality. Of course, the difficulty is that we are looking at a rather unusual Conservative government, because in some respects, at least, although I grant you not in all, it is a Conservative government which has been very Blairite and is much more interventionist in the economy and the role of the state. And this was true before the pandemic, all right? So how much space there is for attacking this government on left-right issues perhaps has been constrained, right? So I think there may be some of it there because the Tories do occasionally.
Can I just ask you one? I promise this is my last intervention. But in 2019, these Remain voting Conservatives stuck with the Tories.
Yes.
The received wisdom is it was because they were scared of Jeremy Corbyn, not necessarily unreasonably. Does that mean that the removal of Corbyn puts these people, who are the people that we're talking to all the time in Cheshire and Amersham, incidentally,
sure, of course,
back in play?
It's certainly not unhelpful. I think I would also take the view that, look, if you were a Conservative, if you were a Remain voter and you were still voting Conservative in 2019, you're probably a pretty die-in-the-wool Conservative. Now, I suspect some of those might be willing to vote for you in a by-election, but won't necessarily go on to do so in a general election. But, you've got to take opportunities as they come. That said, I think, given the numbers I've shown you, I think one of the reasons why the Conservative vote is held up so well amongst Remain voters is indeed some of the people whom you did get last time, in 2019, have gone back to the Tories, right? 10% of your voters have gone back to the Tories, all right? So you've lost some of those as well. So I think some of those Conservative Remain voters who are now back with the Tories can probably be got back, but yes, others are going to be difficult. But I've been up front with you. I think your target is Labour Remain voters. They are the ones who are potentially vulnerable because they are the ones who are not being given a signal by their party that most of them would prefer to hear. All right. Now, that said, let me make another one point and then we should stop. Where I would, as I said earlier, what I think is true is that taking a clear position on Brexit is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. One of my arguments about why you couldn't keep the Labour voters in 2019 was because you had nothing else in your offer to keep them there. There was the rest of your party's policy platform had very low visibility. It was your only USP was, we're going to cancel Brexit. You need more than one USP, all right? And so you've got to think about what are other domestic policy platforms that might also appeal to socially conservative, pro-Brexit voters. So it isn't just therefore hanging on the Brexit tree, but is also then reinforced by other policy ideas, which legalizing cannabis is an obvious one, but virtually nobody heard anything about in 2019. But similar policy positions to that would reinforce the appeal to what I would regard as just your core electorate.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Alistair. Thank you very much for your interjections as well. I do appreciate you giving your musings as well on some of the things that John has said. Now, appreciate we've got 15 minutes or so left, so I want to start bringing in some questions from the audience. I would have loved to have let that go on, but I want to make sure we get some other people in. So there's been a few people patiently waiting to ask some questions. So first of all, apologies. I just see the name is David with the hand up. I don't have a second name. But David, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is David Warren, and I'm a Liberal Democrat member in the Horsham and Crawley area. And I'm quite a rare Liberal Democrat activist and member, because prior to joining the party in 2010, I was a trade union officer, and prior to that, I was a blue-collar worker, postman. And really interesting comments from John, and I just want to really ask him a question about whether he agrees with me that the party has now got a bit of an identity crisis. And I'll say why I think that. It's roughly 100 years since the Liberal Party went into third place behind Labour. And when I joined the party 10 years ago with the big surge in the poll ratings in 2010, I thought, if things keep going like this, the Liberal Democrats could replace Labour as the second party. Mm-hmm. And there have been a few good years before that. I mean, in the 70s, there was the big surge in February 74. And then in 1983, there was an election where the Alliance got 25% of the vote. And it really picks up on what John was saying just now, actually. In that election, the Alliance had a clearly set out set of policies. They were very much positioned between a very left-wing Labour Party, a quite right-wing Conservative Party. And you could point, one of the things, for example, that they promoted in that period was co-ownership of industry, which my parents were Liberal voters. They were very keen on that. They worked for John Lewis Partnership, who were very much for that kind of working. And the worry I've got in the party at the moment is that if you go beyond the Remain position, I think you just mentioned it, John, go beyond the Remain position, people don't know what Liberal Democrats stand for. And if we want to get out and promote, to bring in more people, get a bigger voting base, we really have to have a set of policies that go beyond our position on the EU.
No, although I've strongly argued that you should be opposing EU, I also entirely agree with you that you need more of that, and that one of the problems is that the party's policy positions are not terribly well known, etc., etc. And of course, this is a good time for thinking about. The honest truth is that anybody who's interested in public policy at the moment faces quite a substantial intellectual challenge, which is what kind of post-COVID society do we want to create? So there are enormous opportunities here for innovation, etc., and for bright ideas that might help to give a party visibility. But absolutely. I think this is absolutely, it is as important as picking up a pretty clear position on Remain. That's undoubtedly the case. But ideally, you'll get the policy positions that help also to appeal to those, to the constituency of people that you would expect to appeal to anyway. Because in a sense, part of where the Liberal Democrats are, the other implication of my message is you have never ever you have not significantly repaired the damage of the coalition, right? And the coalition damaged your connection with a lot of your core constituency. You've got to reconnect with that. You've got to think of policy positions that will do that, and then you've got to promote them in a way that's certainly been more effective than in recent years.
Thanks, John. And just I'll move on to some other questions. If we've only got sort of 10 minutes left, if everybody could just keep questions very, very brief so we can get through as many as possible. So Stan Collins, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. Yeah. It's about the pandemic. The government has a lamentable record on this pandemic, and yet we and all the other opposition parties seem to have let them off the hook. There's almost been a wartime approach to it. You can't really attack the government. And is there any polling evidence about this? Because I certainly, talking to people rather than canvassing, find that there is pent-up anger there. They're aware of just how badly this has been handled. Yeah. Yet they don't have a voice. And how can we capitalize on this? I mean, one thing, should we, instead of asking for a public inquiry, which seems to be the, lessons will be learned and then ignored, should we actually be saying, no, we don't want a public inquiry. We want to have a full externally moderated police investigation of all aspects of this, and really up the stakes on this, and make it something of an issue on which we are attacking the government.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because I mean you're right. I mean, there is a constraint on opposition parties in attacking the government on this issue, because at the end of the day, we all want the government to succeed, and that's been a constraint from the beginning. So you can attack the government on tactics, but you can't really attack it in terms of objectives. The truth is, public opinion is quite clear. Public opinion thinks the government pretty much fouled up the first wave of the pandemic, but they think they've done brilliantly on vaccines. And the fact that they've done brilliantly on vaccines means that overall levels of satisfaction with the government's handling of the pandemic are markedly better than they were. It's probably why, however, what happens in the next few weeks are absolutely crucial. If, and it's obviously a big if indeed the government does go for pretty much unlocking everything in England, which supposedly was meant to be doing, though I think Matt Hancock is beginning to row back. I mean, if the government releases too quickly at the end of June, such that despite the current levels of vaccination, we do begin to get significantly high levels of hospitalization and cases, then it could undo, from its own perspective, a lot of its own good work. If, on the other hand, it either delays a bit, because it looks as though once everybody's got 2 vaccines, it probably is going to be under question mark reasonable control. Or if it does release and actually it doesn't take off, then yeah, I mean, there clearly will be questions to be asked about the handling of the pandemic. I think, for my money, the most crucial thing we learned from Cummings was that all the decisions are being made by Johnson. And that therefore means at some point it will potentially provide fodder for an attack on whether or not actually you think that Boris Johnson is a competent prime minister or not. So, and obviously there are other issues like the Northern Ireland Protocol, etc., which can feed onto this. So it may well be that the issue of competence will come back, but particularly very much on Johnson. But that's probably the area where there may be. But the government's not going to have a public inquiry anytime soon. If the pandemic is indeed got under control and stays under control, there will be more room for the opposition parties to pursue it in the House of Commons, etc. And of course, the select committees are already beginning to pursue it. You can't stop the select committees pursuing. That's why Cummings appeared. But I think that's probably, the good news and the bad news from your point of view is that the vaccine seems to be working.
Thanks, John. And I'm going to just bring in my lovely assistant, John Potter. John, have you been scrolling the chat room? Is there any questions?
There's a few. I mean, one thing that did come up, what was interesting, John, and thank you very much for coming on, is the fact that one of the things you said about the Lib Dems and being a rejoin kind of statement that we need to be going forward. I think actually what you're saying is mirroring party policy. It's just a matter of when. And I think that's what the party is. There's no doubt everyone thinks that Lib Dems are a pro-rejoin party, but we're just saying probably now just isn't the right time to do it, and whether that would drive people off, because have we lost that argument for the time being? So that's or you're saying no, just go for it now and just.
I mean, look, you know, this is just there just isn't the evidence out there to suggest. You know, I mean, if you ask people whether we should rejoin or stay out, I mean, the truth is that at the moment, stay out is a bit more popular than rejoin, because yes, there is a small body of Remain voters who would still vote Remain, who would not vote to rejoin, right? But that's it. You are still talking about something between 45 and 50% of the electorate who would vote to rejoin. And by the way, that was, I mean, given that Leave voters were undoubtedly in a minority in December 2019, the fact that you are in a small minority should not put anybody off thinking this is potentially an election-winning position. Boris Johnson took a minority position, because it was a minority position by late 2019, and went with it and won.
Okay, and I'll bring in a question that I've got as well, because we're hosts, we can do what we want.
We're just abusing your position, John.
So I'm very interested, and in your because I'm a northern council, I'm a triple-headed council here in Preston, in Lancashire. Right. So obviously, we don't want to be thinking like we want to just ignore basically all the Midlands and the North. And in particular, we've got Tom Morrison, who is was our parliamentary candidate for Cheadle. So yes. What would be your message for people like that who are in a genuine...
But you're talking at relatively middle-class, affluent Greater Manchester.
Yeah. So it's just the same. You say it's the same, regardless that the Remain vote.
Yeah, I don't. You know, I mean, the other thing to realise is this: is that you know, there are still lots of Remain voters in constituencies where a small majority voted to Leave. I mean, this is one of the ironies about Labour's position. Even in Labour Leave constituencies, the majority of Labour voters voted Remain.
Does just to kind of follow up, and then I'm going to bring someone in as well, John, that's got another question. Just if we were to go down that single track of sort of rejoin.
A track, well, not a single track.
A track of rejoin. But is there, obviously you said in 2019 the difficulty is that there wasn't enough of a USP outside of our policy on Brexit. But was it a case of, because I would say, and I appreciate I'm a political wonk, if you will, that we did have other policies that were quite, forward-thinking, unique, but they were drowned out by that Brexit. If we continue to bang the drum on the rejoin point, does that then drown out any other USPs?
Well, not unless you make them reinforcing, right? And the point about Remain voters is that they are socially liberal voters. So you've got to think of other policies that fit the party's social liberal preferences that are capable of also appealing to that constituency. So that rather than Brexit drowning out, you're painting a vision of a kind of Britain that you want to create, in which Brexit is an integral part of a broader synoptic message.
Okay, we've got John. Are you all right if we run over just slightly? I've got a couple of more. Yeah. So Simon, are you on the call? I know Simon, you wanted to ask a question about the Greens.
Yeah, thanks. I apologise for my tardiness. By the way, I did come in late. So I ran for mayor in Greater Manchester, and the Greens jumped into third place.
Yeah.
And they also successfully jumped into second place in a ward local to me. And we found a huge machine behind them, what looked like a huge machine. Yeah. And it looked like they're taking our playbook and they're running with it. Yeah. That's fine, it's campaigning. But how worried should we be as Liberal Democrats of the Greens, especially with these socially liberal voters out there that care about the environment, but also care about social liberal issues?
Let me give you a broader answer to that question. The Liberal Democrats are now 5th in Scotland, behind the Greens. They are 3rd in London Assembly and mayoral elections behind the Greens. You're right about Greater Manchester. I mean, the Greens are kind of quite strong in London borough elections now, too, in various places. The party, I mean, just fortunate for it that nobody else did badly enough for them to fall behind in Wales. But, you know, won't take very much for anybody to overtake the party in Wales. I mean, you know, I mean, if I were wanting to give the really pessimistic end, yeah, the party does have to start asking itself questions, which is that unless it starts to recover across the piece pretty soon, that it is at risk of ending up no longer even looking like the third stroke, fourth stroke, fifth party in various significant parts of the United Kingdom. And that is something that potentially feeds on itself. So, yeah, I think the answer is you should be worried about the fact that you are now no longer automatically the third party stroke fourth party in Scotland. That is, and you know, and it's not just odd elections, it's now a persistent pattern.
Thank you. So, John, just quickly, I was going to ask John Potter, have we got any questions, or if any females would like to raise their hand? We've had a lot of questions from men. I would like some question from some of the female members of the audience as well. John, do we have any in the chat, or would anybody like to raise their hand to ask John a question?
We do have, it's not a lady, unfortunately. Well, I should never assume, but Craig, do you wish to come in? You've raised your hand. Or it might be.
Yeah, hello guys. I'm happy to wait my turn if there are any female members that would like to ask a question.
No, well, if you want to ask your question now, Craig, and we'll hopefully get somebody to raise their hand.
It's a bit of a follow-up to a couple of the previous points surrounding. We live in a bubble where we do think our policies are popular, and at least here in South Essex, where I'm a triple-hatted councillor, we like to tell ourselves that if only we could get our message heard, people would vote for us. I don't know if John could comment on how true that is, and also how we kind of square the circle of, if people don't know about our policies, how do we know if they're popular?
Well, I mean, you know, as a small party with 11 MPs, you've obviously got a publicity struggle. But I suppose the other thing I would say is this, and again, maybe I should be more explicit about this. I think given where you are at, given how weak the party is, I think you should be going for niche markets. In other words, I'm not suggesting that what I am proposing is something that means that you are necessarily going to overtake the Labour Party tomorrow or even by 2024. I am suggesting that basically, because the party's core message is a message that does appeal to and has long, you know, it's always been the case that university graduates, particularly younger ones, have been always more likely to vote for Democrats. But hey, guys, demographically, there are so many more of them now than there used to be, right? Who are also very heavily Remain voters. That what you need to do above all is to reconnect with that core constituency and to show a sensitivity to the needs and aspirations and wishes of that core community. Many of them, of course, also working in public services, you know, and that was something, you know, a sensitivity that was lost and very heavily affected by the tuition fees fiasco. I mean, somebody should just have sat the party down before 2010, said, okay, you might think this is a daft policy. You might be right. But do you realize that this is your USP and that it's a USP that is unique, that is particularly linked to your core constituency? Do you really, really want to reverse your position on this? It is not obvious that you should want to do so, right? So I think, you know, in part, I'm suggesting that, you know, there's a repair job to be there, to be just reconnecting with the kinds of people whom you would expect to be pretty well disposed towards, a fairly traditional liberal message. And you kind of get those people back before you then even think about how you might, having done that, be able to expand your constituency more widely.
Thank you, John. So, and we obviously asked for somebody female to ask a question, and I've seen in the chat if Wendy Chamberlain is there, our great female MP for North East Fife. Wendy, you had a question.
And there's another one as well I've spotted as well.
Thank you. I shouldn't have necessarily, if there was another woman, we should have definitely brought her in. But I suppose just the question I put in the chat is, can a good performance in Cheshire and Amersham be a good game changer for the party?
Yes, look at short answer to that is look at Ribble Valley.
Yeah.
Right, Ribble Valley turned around the prospects of the party. Yes, because that will begin to make people think that actually you do have electoral life in you. I think Cheshire and Amersham is, as I said earlier, potentially a more important constituency than Batley and Spen. And I trust you are doing your best to try and win. And of course, the advantage to you will be is that the commentariat are not following Cheshire and Amersham. Yeah, it's being ignored.
Though Johnson was obviously made a visit today, so that.
Oh, did he? Oh, he's finally turned up.
Maybe suggests that they're starting.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. Ribble Valley was a godsend, all right. But then, of course, you've got to use it thereafter, because all of a sudden you will be a focus of attention, all right. And that's the point at which you've got to have something to say that people want to listen to, and which is going to make, that's what the Liberal Democrats are in favour of. Right? I'm sure all your Dons and St Andrews know exactly what you're in favour of, but you've got to reach a slightly wider audience than that.
Absolutely. And on that point of slightly wider audiences, boundary changes, what are you hearing? Do you think, what do you think they might mean for the party? And my third question is a Scottish question, which is increasingly the narrative in Scotland is if you're pro-UK, you must be pro-Brexit. How do we challenge that? Thank you.
I mean, on the boundary changes, I've not seen any of the detail, but I will give you some of the general points. One is you need to thank Boris Johnson for saving you from your stupidity in trying to reduce the size of the House of Commons in the first place, because it was never in your interest to reduce the size of the House of Commons, because you, of course, are very heavily dependent on keeping constituencies intact. And if you reduce the size of the House of Commons, you reduce your chances of keeping constituencies intact. I would imagine that both, at least Alistair and yourself, given the geographical character of the areas you are in, are probably relatively safe from the boundary. But you now probably know more than I do about what's been done. All right, I don't know whether you've got the email from the Boundary Commission. The fact that the constituencies in South West London are all together should help, and the fact that population in London has been going back up in general. So but that's as much as I could say about the Democrats, because you've got very often. More broadly, the point to understand is this, and of course you don't have any seats in Wales, which is the place that really is going to get cut, right? The broad point is this: is that things have moved on, and the boundary review is not going to profit the Conservatives to the same extent as the boundary review would have done if it had been either of the two previous reviews had been implemented, for two reasons. One is the pattern of population movement in recent years has stopped being one where people decamp out of Labour seats into Conservative ones, not least because of the rise of population in London, which of course is now a one-party state, all right? So lots of Labour constituencies have gained population. And two, in winning red wall constituencies, the Conservatives have won quite a lot of constituencies with below average electorates, which will now get cut by the boundary review. The difference in the difference in the size of the average Labour and the average Conservative constituency in terms of registered electorate in 2019 was little more than 2,000. So once you deal with Wales, the Tories have missed the boat on this. And of course, actually also what may be true is they may also have completely mistimed it, because of course the boundary review is as of the electorates at March 2020.
So 4 months after the
election.
Well,
of course, rumour has it, but we won't really know until we get the census, that of course since the pandemic, that population movement into London has gone back out again, some of it. And we may well discover that by the time these constituencies are in place, they're already out of date, but in a way that's to the Conservatives' advantage. Now, that last point is much more speculative. But actually, this is the Labour Party never spotted. I gave evidence before the Bloody Standing Committee. The party never spotted that actually their constant banging on about the fact that this is unfair, etc., was all out of date, because their constituencies are no longer particularly small, and did not spot the fact that the boundary review was going to be speeded up a wee bit so that the boundaries would be ready in the summer of 2023 rather than October, as opposed to what they should have been. Did any Labour MP on their bloody... No, they did not at all mention this. They didn't spot. Now, of course, by the way, the other thing people haven't spotted, you might quite like this, is that if the Fixed Term Parliaments Act is abolished, then I think that means that the election can also be delayed, because then the legal date will become something like Christmas Day or New Year's Day in 2024, because at the moment it's May 2014. So if we get rid of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, then presumably, depending on the detail, then actually Boris can also go longer as well. So it just maximises his room for manoeuvre.
Okay.
Thank you, Wendy. So I've got 2 more questions in the room, and then I'm going to close the questions, and then I've got one question that I feel is quite important I'd like to ask you that might be slightly of a curveball. But I was just going to say, so Shaya Mali, are you still there? You had your hand up, but I think you've put it down. I think we maybe...
Hello, yes, I'm still here.
Oh, jolly good.
Hi there.
Hello. My question is, the 3 leaders of the main English parties are all, no offence meant to any of them, pale and male, and one of them is not that pale. I just wonder if you think politics is missing something in its leadership.
Well, I mean, in defence...
Do you get that impression that there's just a sort of a greenness beyond Mr. Johnson, because he is clearly quite a colourful character?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, there are a couple of points you could be making there. One is, do we have very much in the way of charismatic politicians? Answer no. And Boris Johnson obviously is one of the exceptions to that. But that I think is also a broader character of our House of Commons these days, is that we have present company accepted. We have less in the way of charismatic politicians more generally, I think. And it's certainly been a problem for the Labour Party, is that, it seriously lacked. Again, apart from Jeremy Corbyn, right, who's kind of... The second point you could be making, obviously, is about the fact that they are all male and they're all white, etc. Well, I mean, at least in defence of the current House of Commons, there are more women than ever. The Labour Party has more female than male MPs, which is the first time any parliamentary party has. And hey, guys, even the Liberal Democrats. Wendy, you can tell me, have you got more women than men in the parliamentary party now?
So 7 of the 11 women are 7 of the 11 MPs are women.
That's right. So you are also a majority. Yeah.
And I'm the only female chief whip currently. First for the party.
Yes, and you've got 2 ethnic minority MPs. Yeah. So I mean, the diversity has proved dramatically, and that is eventually going to work through. And I would not be entirely surprised if at some point in the not too distant future, the Liberal Democrats will end up with a ethnic minority leader. But anyway, I'll leave you to think about that.
Thank you, Joe. And I'm led to believe actually Wendy roams the halls with a shinty stick to whip the other MP. So Mo, you wanted to come in with a question, and then we're going to finish up.
Thanks, David, and thank you to the organisers and to John for putting on this event. I just want to ask briefly about, so I'm a councillor in a pro-Leave London borough in Sutton.
Yes.
And John, you've spoken about policies to appeal to Remainers, but those of us who live and campaign in pro-Leave areas obviously cannot ignore the Leavers. So I just wonder, from your perspective, in which policy areas or with what specific policies can we appeal to Leavers with? Thank you.
That is a good question. I guess what I would be saying to you is that part of the strategy has to be, it's not just simply saying to Remain voters vote for us, but I think you also, in the end, have to try to undermine the confidence of Leave voters in Leave as an option, all right? And that's something the Labour Party isn't doing either. So that, undoubtedly has to be part of the strategy. Otherwise, I guess, well, you have to think about, there are aspects of the government's, policy towards public services, such as, the way in which it's dealt with school leavers, the way in which it's dealt with education. The government is potentially exposed to some degree on the idea that it is levelling up, because there are various aspects of it, not so much on infrastructure policy, but on current spending policy, where it's not proving to be very successful in levelling up. But otherwise, what you've got to realise is that, that Leave electorate is very much an older electorate. It's potentially susceptible to some of the arguments about the competence of handling COVID, because it's older people, who by far and away have had to stay at home. But you might therefore also want to think about something about security of provisions of pensions, etc., etc. Although the truth is, at the moment, the public seem to be much more concerned about the provision of welfare for those of working age than they are about pensions anymore. But that's probably off the top of my head about as far as I am going to go to. It's not an easy nut to crack, and I'll be perfectly open about that.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mo, for the question. And John, just the final question I wanted to put to you, and it was a question that I was asked offline. The person didn't want their name put to the question, but I feel it's something that's very important, and I'm prepared to put it to you because it's something that is not very Lib Dem centric, but I feel it's an important issue, and I think it'd be interesting to get your thoughts from, I guess, a polling perspective as well. So we have a sister party in Northern Ireland, the Alliance Party, and obviously the events that are unfolding right now in Northern Ireland have seen kind of upheaval in both the DUP and the UUP. There's concern about what might happen with Northern Ireland in the long term. Obviously, from my position, I'd like to keep Northern Ireland as part of a united kingdom. But my question was going to be, is how do you perhaps see next year's Northern Ireland Assembly elections playing out, and maybe even particularly for the Alliance, but also for other parties, and kind of how do you think that might affect Britain as a whole?
Okay, I should say straight away, I don't claim to be an expert on Northern Ireland, but I do occasionally read the polls. But I can probably say, it is clear that there is a risk of a significant rift within the unionist community. The DUP in particular is clearly facing a difficult position. Not least basically because, having campaigned for Brexit and having campaigned and having been close to the Conservatives, they then got sold a pup. And two, what also seems to be true is that, Northern Ireland is gradually becoming more socially liberal, and that therefore some of the more socially conservative positions associated with Presbyterianism in Northern Ireland is beginning to cause something of attention in the party. And it might be interesting to see what Arlene Foster says some of that when she's a free spirit. So Brexit is causing trouble. Social change is causing trouble for the DUP in particular. So there's an issue there, whereas it looks as though Sinn Féin are likely to remain the largest party in the nationalist community. And ergo, even if Sinn Féin don't do any better than last time, they have a serious chance of coming first and therefore becoming first, O'Neill becoming First Minister. That doesn't necessarily change the balance of support for relationships, for whether you want to be unifying with Northern Ireland or for United Kingdom, on which the polling evidence is somewhat mixed. I mean, some polling suggests there's only a narrow lead for the union, others suggest it's a rather bigger lead. But obviously what is true, and I think, the other thing you have to think about the future of the union, apart from the potential immediate crisis for unionism, what is the long-term fallout from that within the unionist community, is that, because Northern Ireland is part of the single market, and given the difficulties that are being created in terms of trading between the North and Great Britain, almost inevitably trade with the Republic will grow and trade with Great Britain will diminish, such that the economic arguments for Northern Ireland remaining in the Union will be weakened. And at the same time, we know that the demographics, the long-term demographics, mean that the nationalist community is growing. And if the Republic is economically successful once more, which it's got back to being, wouldn't want to put too much money on Northern Ireland necessarily being a long-term member of the United Kingdom, for which you have to understand there is very little enthusiasm in Great Britain. England wants to hang on to Scotland. Large parts of England, frankly, doesn't care tuppence halfpenny about Northern Ireland. And if you are a unionist on Northern Ireland, you need to understand that the public foundations upon which Northern Ireland's membership of the UK rests are pretty fragile.
Thank you, John, and thank you for your thoughts on that. I know it was a slightly left field question considering everything we've spoken about tonight. And look, that brings us to a close on the podcast. So all that remains to be said is, first of all, John, thank you so much for giving us some of your time this evening. And also I've slightly kicked it on a bit from the time we agreed to finish by. So we thank you for willing to stay on and listen to some of the questions and your very forthright answers, and obviously what you prepared to kick us off. And thank you to everybody in the audience who asked a question of John. So, John, thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks so much indeed. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Speak soon.